Why would an airline fly between Abu Dhabi and Charlotte? Why would an airline want to fly between Addis Ababa and Hanoi? And why on earth does Qantas, Australia's primary international airline, fly between Auckland and New York? These routes don't really make any sense, but they reveal clever airline strategy, powerful alliances, and even a legal loophole that allows flights like New York to Auckland and Milan. Charlotte might seem like an unlikely candidate for non-stop flights to the Middle East. It's only the 23rd largest city in the US by metro population, and Charlotte doesn't even have flights to Asia or South America. But it happens to be home to one of the world's largest airline hubs, thanks to American Airlines, which is where Etihad Airways comes in. The airline plans on launching Abu Dhabi to Charlotte flights in 2026, which shocked many. But it's not really about Charlotte, it's about American Airlines. That's because they have a code-share agreement with them, meaning passengers can connect to places beyond North Carolina, where Etihad does something similar on a global scale out of their hub at Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi, meaning they offer seamless connections to places like Delhi or Mumbai. But that's not the full story. Etihad plans on using their 787 on this market, meaning that the plane is perfect for fuel efficiency, range, and offering the right number of seats, meaning that the route has a potential higher chance of succeeding as long as they can code-share with American while minimizing the losses in case demand doesn't materialize. But code-shares can only go so far. Joint ventures are much more powerful as they allow up to multiple airlines to act like one in a certain geography. The Atlantic with Delta, Air France, KLM, and Virgin Atlantic is a perfect example, which has led to some strange routes, such as when Delta used to operate a winter-only flight when demand is soft between Chicago and Paris. A market that might sound like a slam dunk, they're both big cities, but not even American Airlines offered the route in the winter, despite having a hub where Delta did not at O'Hare. That flight wasn't just about Chicago to Paris, it was more about Paris to Chicago. That's because Air France has a massive hub at Charles de Gaulle Airport, meaning they can flow passengers from around the world into Chicago, and they can do this in coordination with Delta with scheduling and pricing, meaning that the airlines could more closely match demand, as Air France operated a slightly larger plane like the A330-200 with more seats during the summer when everybody wants to go to Europe, while Delta operated the flight with a smaller 767-300ER. But it's also a very efficient use of aircraft utilization. Since most demand to Europe is during the summer, it's hard for an airline like Delta to find good use for their 767-300ER in the winter, while Air France could use the A330 or whatever plane they use elsewhere in their global network. This isn't possible without the power of joint ventures. Some routes reflect diaspora demand, or VFR, visiting family, friends, and relatives. Take Royal Jordanian's flight from Amman to Detroit, for example. It's an odd choice considering that the airline doesn't serve LA or Houston, cities with large Arab populations. Detroit's Arab population traces its roots more to Lebanon and Iraq, so why doesn't an airline from Lebanon or Iraq serve Detroit? Well, MEA, or Middle Eastern Airlines, hasn't served North America since the 80s, while Iraqi Airways doesn't have a Category 1 FAA safety rating, meaning they're not allowed to fly to the US. Royal Jordanian, which does, becomes the proxy, and Amman becomes a connecting point not only to cities like Beirut or Baghdad, but across the Middle East. The route also used to have a stopover in Montreal, but Royal Jordanian couldn't sell tickets between Montreal and Detroit because they didn't have Fifth Freedom rights. which is where international aviation law comes in. Fifth freedom flights were formed in 1944, along with other freedoms of the air to help facilitate global air travel. But to operate a fifth freedom flight, both countries have to approve. If Royal Jordanian got approval from both the US and Canada, assuming they even applied, then they could have operated passengers between Montreal and Detroit and vice versa, which would have helped them generate more revenue versus having seats going out empty, unsold, unused. But Canada has approved such flights before. Between 1996 and 2020, Cathay Pacific had a stopover in Vancouver for their flights between Hong Kong and New York. While that stop made sense in the 90s, by 2004, Cathay Pacific started operating Hong Kong to New York flights non-stop, and eventually ramped up service up to 3 times a day from JFK, including another one from Newark. But the strange thing is that at the time, no US airline operated flights from JFK to Vancouver, despite Delta, JetBlue, and American having massive operations at the airport. Philippines Airlines also operated a stopover in Vancouver up until 2018, until they got rid of that stopover. They didn't need their refueling stop, as they could fly nonstop to Manila with the A350, meaning that for over a year, Cathay Pacific had a virtual monopoly on the Vancouver to New York segment, and vice versa. Fifth freedom flights aren't the only legal nuance. There's also eighth freedom flights, or cabotage, and it's where airlines can operate domestic flights within a country as long as the flight originates from the origin country. That's how Qantas used to fly from Australia to LA, then onward to JFK, though Qantas couldn't sell tickets between LAX and JFK, so it wasn't a true eighth freedom flight. Most countries don't allow this, including the US and even the EU, where a carrier like Ryanair, based in Ireland, can fly from Berlin to Barcelona, or even Barcelona to Ibiza. But the EU treats the flights there as domestic flights, so that doesn't really count, and plus, it's not really that strange. Qantas eventually dropped the LAX JFK flight because it was inefficient, so they started a flight from Auckland to New York instead, where the stop lets them legally sell tickets on both the JFK to Auckland leg and vice versa, and for connecting passengers going onwards to Australia. Ironically, this flight uses the same plane that Etihad plans on using on their Abu Dhabi to Charlotte flights, the Boeing 787, which in many ways has killed Fifth Freedom flights by eliminating refueling stops, but also creating demand for new ones, like with Ethiopian Airlines and how they fly from New York to West Africa before going to Addis Ababa. It's aircraft like the 787 and Airbus A350 that make the economics of routes like these work. But then there are 2 airlines, Emirates and United, that took Fifth Freedom flights to a whole new level. Emirates operates unusual routes like JFK to Milan using the A380, the world's largest passenger plane, which taps into strong transatlantic premium demand out of New York. They also fly from high-altitude airports like Bogota and Mexico City, which have limited aircraft range due to thinner air, so they can't fly nonstop to Dubai. These flights stop in places like Barcelona and Miami, which were not chosen randomly, but because there's strong local demand on those segments. United also recently brought back Fifth Freedom flights in ways that haven't been seen in many years, with flights like Ulaanbaatar to Tokyo Narita, and starting in October 2025, Hong Kong to Ho Chi Minh City. These are tag-on segments of longer US-bound routes, like Flight 6 for example, which originates in Mongolia, stopping in Tokyo and continuing to Houston, while Flight 152 starts in Los Angeles, stops in Hong Kong, and then goes to Ho Chi Minh City. What makes these flights even more strange is that they are operated by a different aircraft and crew, meaning that as long as the flight number is the same and the flight originates in the home country, it's legal. Other routes defy expectations due to trade, business, or even diplomacy. Ethiopian Airlines' flight from Addis Ababa to Hanoi is expected to carry everything from agricultural goods to electronics, all while forging a new trade bridge between East Africa and Southeast Asia. And then there's Hainan Airlines flight from Tijuana to Beijing. It's a clever workaround, where the airport is situated right on the border, meaning that there's a pedestrian bridge that connects the airport to California. But really the biggest reason they operate this flight from Mexico is because the US and China don't have an open skies agreement, meaning the airlines operating between the two countries can't just add capacity at free will like an airline could between the US and Germany. So they bypass this by flying into Mexico, which also probably has lower landing fees and labor costs. But what do all of these routes have in common? They're not random, they're strategic. They're the product of evolving technology, alliances, diaspora or VFR ties, legal frameworks, and geopolitical maneuvering. Here's what we can learn from them. A route that might not make sense on the surface might make more sense if you look beyond. There could be a giant hub, a code share, a VFR corridor, while planes like the 787 and A350 don't just connect cities, they build a new business model. Some flights are geopolitical power plays, trade bridges, or clever workarounds to aviation agreements. So the next time you see a route that makes you scratch your head, don't assume it's random. Chances are it's a masterclass in aviation strategy. Because in aviation, a strange route is really just a smart one in disguise.